You're the royal physician of Spain. The year is 1834. The king is dead. But your job isn't over. In fact, the most disturbing assignment of your entire career is only just beginning. You've been summoned in the middle of the night not to treat the living, but to preserve the corpse of Ferdinand VII. You expect mourning, silence, ceremony. What you find is horror. The Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands pale and trembling beside her husband's lifeless body. She doesn't speak at first, just points toward the bed where something massive and unnatural lies beneath the silk sheets. As you approach, your stomach tightens. This is no ordinary corpse. And what waits under the linen is not a face twisted in death or a wound from illness. It's a grotesque biological anomaly, something so malformed, so monstrous that history itself has refused to speak of it. The king's penis. A thing of legend, a source of whispered jokes in the palace halls for decades now, lies before you in full horrifying detail. 14 inches long, warped in shape, scarred from failed surgeries, covered in thickened tissue like bark on a dying tree. You realize in that moment that you're not preserving a man's anatomy. You're preserving the symbol of a reign defined by pain, obsession, dysfunction, and decay. For Ferdinand VII, his deformed genitals weren't just a private tragedy, they were the engine of national collapse. 3 wives were broken by it, his mind was warped by it. And now Spain itself lies in ruins because of it. This is not just a body. It is a monument to everything that went wrong, not just in one man's life, but in the kingdom he ruled. And as your trembling hands reach for the surgical instruments, you wonder, how did something so deeply personal become a disaster that consumed an entire empire? This is the story history tried to bury, but we're going to dig it up. Of all the kings born into power, Ferdinand VII entered this world not with destiny in his blood, but with a curse. Not the kind whispered by witches in the woods or scrawled in ancient ink by heretics. No, his curse was written in chromosomes, in twisted strands of royal DNA corrupted by centuries of incestuous marriages and dynastic pride. When Ferdinand gasped his first breath on October 14, 1784, in the echoing halls of El Escorial Palace, Spain, didn't know it had just welcomed the embodiment of its slow-motion downfall. But the warning signs were already there, hidden in the bloodlines and the unnatural closeness of kin who should never have shared a bed. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, were first cousins. Their union was part of a tradition among the Spanish Bourbons and Habsburgs to keep power pure by keeping marriage in the family. It was a tradition that ignored science, sanity, and eventually humanity itself. By the late 18th century, the Spanish royal family was a genetic time bomb. For generations, uncles had married nieces, cousins had produced cousins, and legitimate heirs were born from unions that would have been criminal by modern standards. The Habsburg jaw, a protruding, disfiguring facial trait, was just the beginning. Hidden beneath the velvet and lace were neurological disorders, hormonal imbalances, and in Ferdinand's case, anatomical deformities, so extreme they defied medical understanding. He wasn't born merely sickly or fragile, he was born wrong. The kind of wrong that doctors didn't dare describe in full and courtiers only whispered about when the doors were locked and the wine was flowing. As an infant, Ferdinand was pale, often feverish and strangely quiet. But it was as he grew into boyhood that something far more disturbing began to emerge. His body did not develop like other boys. One physician, whose name was erased from official records but survives in a hidden Vatican report, described the early signs of an abnormally elongated phallus with irregular girth and unnatural curvature. It sounds like the setup to a vulgar joke, but for the Spanish court, it was a slow-building tragedy. By the time Ferdinand reached adolescence, his condition had evolved from concerning to monstrous. Whispers grew louder. Servants exchanged stories of the prince requiring custom-made clothing. Tutors noticed his temper unpredictable, cruel, and defensive when others got too close. He avoided bathing in front of others, refused physician examinations, and once allegedly ordered the flogging of a page boy who accidentally caught sight of him undressing. But beyond the anatomical horror lay something deeper, the psychological rot that grows when a child learns to hate his own body. Ferdinand's identity was forged in shame. In an era when masculinity was measured by physical refinement, Greek statue ideals of beauty, moderation, and proportion, Ferdinand was a grotesque outlier, a freak of royal design, and he knew it. He wasn't just mocked by others. He mocked himself in silence, stewing in paranoia that turned every glance into an insult and every laugh into betrayal. He would grow up believing that the world saw him not as a prince, not as a future king, but as a malformed thing hiding behind protocol and power. And in response, he would become cold, vengeful, manipulative. The tragedy is this: Ferdinand VII was born with the body of a king but the wiring of a tortured child. His physical form was a deformity sculpted by dynastic arrogance by centuries of monarchs who chose bloodlines over biology, image over integrity. And the consequences would not stop at his bedroom door. They would spill outward into his marriages, his politics, and his rule. Spain didn't just inherit a king, it inherited a pathology. A man whose body was broken before he ever held a scepter. A man who would in time break everything he touched. And it all began at birth, with a crown on his head and a time bomb between his legs. Imagine growing up in a palace where every mirror reflects not power, but deformity, where every laugh behind closed doors might be about you, and where the one thing that defines your masculinity, your body, your future, your legacy, is not a source of pride, but an object of horror. This was the world Ferdinand VII inherited as he entered adolescence. And it didn't just shape his character, it shattered it. Long before he wore the crown of Spain, Ferdinand wore a crown of shame. The whispers had already begun by the time he was 12. Servants noticed that the prince refused to dress in front of others. His laundry required special tailoring. He limped when he walked too fast. But it wasn't until a young court physician, summoned for a routine checkup, left the chamber pale and shaken, that the palace began to understand the depth of the prince's affliction. Hidden beneath the royal robes was an anatomical anomaly so grotesque that it would become the subject of hidden medical records, coded journal entries, and hushed rumors passed between embassies. The deformity had grown with him. Misshapen, disproportionately large, and visibly unnatural, it turned Ferdinand's most intimate body part into the court's most whispered-about secret. He became obsessed with concealment. His baths were taken in private. His linens were handled only by trusted staff. A page boy who accidentally glimpsed him changing clothes was not merely dismissed, he was publicly flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one would witness the prince's shame and live to speak of it. But paranoia doesn't work that way. It isn't satisfied by silence. It breeds in the cracks, grows in the shadows, and feeds on fear. Ferdinand's perception of the world began to warp. He believed courtiers were mocking him through coded compliments, that the way nobles bowed too low or too quickly was a hidden insult, that formal titles spoken with too much emphasis were laced with sarcasm. Even the smiles of potential brides became suspect. Did they know? Were they laughing inside? Did their fathers warn them to the outside world he was still a prince, but inside he was a caged animal watching, remembering, tallying every perceived humiliation? His tutors noticed it first, a shift in tone. Once an obedient, if melancholic student, Ferdinand became defensive, then cruel. He would humiliate servants in front of guests, demand confessions for offenses no one understood. He began testing his power in small ways, having musicians dismissed for playing the wrong note, scolding guards for blinking at the wrong time. It wasn't power he was testing. It was control. In a world where he had no control over his own body, control over others became his only refuge. The court began to walk on eggshells. And that, more than anything, made it worse. Ferdinand could feel the discomfort in every room he entered. And discomfort to a man consumed by self-loathing feels like judgment. The more they feared offending him, the more he believed he was being ridiculed. And the more he believed he was ridiculed, the crueler he became. This cycle of humiliation, paranoia, retaliation became the core of his personality. He wasn't merely afraid of being mocked. He expected it. He needed it. It was the only justification for the rage that boiled inside him. He developed a long memory for insult. A sideways glance at age 14 could cost someone a career by age 20. And as he grew older, the list of enemies in his mind grew longer. Courtiers, physicians, diplomats, even family members. Everyone was a suspect. Everyone was guilty of seeing what he wished could be hidden. Ferdinand's adolescence wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a warning shot for the kind of ruler he would become. A king whose cruelty wasn't rooted in greed or conquest, but in trauma. A ruler whose tyranny was shaped not by ideology, but by humiliation. His paranoia wasn't political, it was anatomical. And his need for absolute control was born not in the war room, but in the shame of a bedroom he could never enter without fear. This was the making of a monster, not by birthright, but by the gaze of others. It was supposed to be a royal fairy tale. A young devout princess from Naples, betrothed to the heir of Spain, one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe. Maria Antonia had been raised on romantic notions of duty, faith, and noble love. She believed her wedding to Ferdinand VII would mark the beginning of a grand destiny. Instead, it marked the beginning of a nightmare so intimate, so medically disturbing, and so psychologically destructive that it would be erased from official history and buried beneath centuries of sanitized royal archives. But the truth was never fully hidden. It was only whispered in fear and in shame. When Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid in 1802, she was just 17. She was graceful, educated, and sheltered, raised in the deeply Catholic court of Naples, where young girls were taught that obedience and modesty were the twin pillars of queenship. No one had prepared her for what awaited her on the other side of the altar. The wedding ceremony was grand, a sea of silks and candles, music echoing through cathedral walls, nobles kneeling before the new princess as Spain welcomed its future queen. But behind the brocade curtains, far from the public eye, a different kind of preparation was underway, one that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. Ferdinand's physicians had already designed the night in clinical detail. His condition, deemed sexually incompatible with conventional intercourse, required special instruments. Custom-made cushions, specially lubricated salves, and complex positioning tools were delivered to the royal bedchamber in secret. His deformity was no longer just a personal affliction. It was a mechanical obstacle that had to be engineered around like a battlefield wound. Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting, confused and alarmed, were told only that certain aids were customary for royal couples. No one explained to the princess why her husband could not consummate the marriage like any other man. That explanation arrived in the flesh, unexpected, unwanted, and unforgettable. The moment Ferdinand disrobed, Maria Antonia screamed. A scream so primal and sustained that guards rushed into the corridor thinking an assassin had entered the room. She didn't see a husband. She saw a monster. One of her attendants later wrote in a private letter, never meant for publication, that the queen clung to the wall like a cornered animal, crying, "Take it away, take it away," as if his body itself were an act of violence. His member, grotesquely long, warped in shape, with unnatural growths and uneven girth, looked like something crafted by a mad god part, punishment part joke. The wedding night did not end with passion. It ended with sedation. Laudanum was administered. Cushions were arranged. And what followed was more surgery than sex, an act choreographed by doctors, rather than desired by lovers. Even then, it left Maria Antonia bruised and broken both physically and mentally. And it would not be the last time. In the months that followed, the marriage devolved into ritualized violation. Every attempt at intimacy required the presence of physicians' careful preparation, medical tools, and opiates. Maria Antonia began increasing her dosage of laudanum, not out of addiction at first, but out of desperation. The only way she could endure what had become her marital duty was by escaping into numbness. Eventually, she became addicted not just to the drug, but to the illusion that this nightmare could be endured if she simply disappeared inside herself. Ferdinand, meanwhile, grew darker. Her revulsion pierced his deepest insecurity. Her tears became accusations. He began to see her pain not as a tragedy, but as betrayal. Why couldn't she just endure it? Why couldn't she give him an heir? He blamed her for their failures, for her fragility, for her lack of submission. And so he sought control. He ordered restraints crafted by the same artisans who made his hunting gear to keep her in place during intercourse. What began as humiliation became cruelty. Maria Antonia miscarried twice, once in the 4th month, once at nearly full term. The second loss nearly killed her, and something in her broke forever. She withdrew from public life, clung to confession, and began to believe that she was cursed, that her body was rejecting her role as queen, not by rebellion, but by divine judgment. She died in 1807 at the age of 21. The official cause fever, the real cause trauma, physical, psychological, and unrelenting. Her body was buried, but her pain lingered in the haunted palace halls, in the rumors that followed Ferdinand for the rest of his reign, and in the quiet realization that Spain's future had already begun to rot from the inside out. The tragedy of Maria Antonia wasn't just that she was the first to suffer, it's that she wouldn't be the last. If the royal bedchamber had become a stage for horror, then what came next turned that stage into a laboratory of desperation. After the trauma of their wedding night, Ferdinand VII and Maria Antonia didn't retreat into silence, they descended into obsession. The mission was clear: produce an heir. And if nature wouldn't cooperate, then medicine, magic, and madness would have to take its place. What followed was not a marriage, but a series of controlled experiments on the human body conducted under velvet drapes in the dim candlelight of palatial chambers, with the fate of a crumbling empire hanging in the balance. By the standards of the early 19th century, infertility was a private grief, but for Ferdinand, it was a national emergency. Spain needed an heir, and he needed to prove his manhood. But neither his body nor his mind were capable of delivering. And so began the parade of charlatans, mystics, court physicians, and foreign experts who promised miracles, each more unhinged than the last. The king spent fortunes on remedies that veered between the absurd and the obscene. Rhinoceros horn powder from Africa, ground pearls mixed with opium, elixirs laced with crushed coral deer antler, and even powdered mummy dust because someone whispered that it was potent with ancient life. Every one of them promised restoration. None of them worked. But Ferdinand kept drinking, kept swallowing, kept believing. Because to accept his failure was to confront the one truth he couldn't bear, that the very thing that made him a man, his anatomy, was also what made him useless as a king. His desperation made him an easy mark. He would try anything, believe anyone. His chambers began to resemble an alchemist's nightmare shelves of bubbling vials, strange powders, tinctures sent by Persian scholars and French aphrodisiacs dealers, many of whom weren't doctors at all, just opportunists selling royal delusion by the bottle. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, bore the brunt of it. Every failed potion led to another scheduled procedure, another night of terror. When the elixirs didn't work, the king turned to timing, tracking lunar cycles, astrological alignments, and even obscure biblical dates. Court astrologers were summoned to Madrid, offering charts and rituals that might increase fertility if the stars were properly aligned. The queen's menstrual cycles were tracked like a military campaign. Ovulation was treated like a battlefield deadline. And miraculously, twice she became pregnant. The first time in 1804, the court rejoiced. Trumpets rang out, cathedrals held special masses, and Spain briefly exhaled. But 4 months in, the queen began bleeding. The miscarriage was quiet, hidden behind palace doors, and no official announcement was made. Ferdinand was enraged, not with fate, but with her. He accused her of weakness, of moving wrong, of not believing enough in the rituals. She wept, and he watched with cold eyes. The second pregnancy in 1805 was even more tragic. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost to term. But the labor was brutal days of screaming blood loss fever. The child was lost in a torrent of crimson, and the queen was left bedridden for weeks, barely surviving. She emerged not as a mother, but as a ghost of herself. Laudanum use became constant. Her eyes went dull, her voice grew quiet, and her faith, once her refuge, turned into obsessive prayer. She begged God to forgive her for sins she couldn't name and for failing in duties she never chose. Ferdinand responded the only way he knew how: control. He blamed her for the miscarriage. He accused her of sabotaging the pregnancy, of conspiring with liberal elements to prevent the birth of a proper Catholic heir. Her chambermaids were interrogated. The court apothecary, the one who administered her sedatives, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. A letter he had written was seized by royal guards and never seen again. Behind the public mask of grief, Ferdinand was quietly relieved. He believed that Maria Antonia was defective, that she had served her purpose and failed. Within weeks, his advisors began searching for a new bride, but the truth remained unspoken. The real defect lay with the king himself. His condition had turned conception into a nightmare pregnancy, into torture, and childbirth into near death. What should have been a private tragedy became a political ritual soaked in blood and silence. The king still believed he could fix it with the right potion, the right ritual, the right woman. He was wrong, but his delusion would drive him deeper into the darkness, and his court with him. And Spain, trapped in the gravity of his obsession, was already beginning to collapse. They said she was lucky. That unlike Maria Antonia, the first wife who died young and broken, Isabelle of Portugal, would have the advantage of knowledge, that she would be prepared, that she knew what she was marrying into. But no amount of warning, no whispered horror from the court physicians, no quiet confession from terrified maids could have possibly prepared her for the monster that waited behind the wedding veil. Because this wasn't a marriage, it was a sentence. Isabella was 19 when she arrived in Madrid in 1816, a princess raised in the structured court of Lisbon, schooled in royal decorum, religion, and the expectations of queenship. She was intelligent, observant, and reportedly more worldly than her predecessor. But she was still young, still hopeful, and above all, still naive enough to believe that duty could conquer fear. Her first sight of Ferdinand at the altar gave her pause. He was older than expected, gaunt with paranoia, his skin, pallid eyes darting. But nothing in that moment suggested what would follow. The royal wedding was as magnificent as ever, baroque music, cascading flowers, a parade of nobles and generals. A perfect facade. But beneath that gold-threaded ceremony lay a blueprint for controlled horror. Ferdinand's physicians had prepared extensively. New marital aids had been commissioned, this time from German and Ottoman craftsmen engineered with medical precision to accommodate the king's ever-worsening deformity. A new generation of restraining devices had been produced. Oils, herbal sedatives, anatomically adjusted cushions, even a redesigned bed frame reinforced with iron. The wedding night was to be a clinical operation more than an act of love, and it went worse than anyone imagined. The screams echoed through the palace corridors before midnight, not cries of passion but of terror, of pain. Servants found shattered glass, overturned furniture, and blood on the sheets. Isabella had collapsed into convulsions. One maid claimed she bit through her lip from sheer panic. Her hands clutched the sheets so tightly that her fingernails tore. No one spoke of it publicly. The court's version was that the queen took ill from excitement. But those who served in the inner chambers knew the truth. What Ferdinand brought to bed wasn't intimacy, it was an anatomical nightmare, and Isabella had been his next unwilling victim. From that night on, she was never the same. Her once confident posture gave way to hunched shoulders and darting eyes. She developed a stutter. She flinched whenever her husband entered the room. Physicians referred to her condition as female hysteria, the catch-all term of the era. Today, we'd call it what it truly was: trauma. Severe, continuous, and untreated. The Queen began experiencing what we now recognize as post-traumatic flashbacks, waking from nightmares, screaming about the thing and refusing to be left alone in dark rooms. Her body shook. She stopped eating regularly. Her ladies-in-waiting described her as a ghost in silks. Ferdinand saw her terror not as tragedy, but as insult. In his mind, Isabella's revulsion was a threat to his pride. He interpreted her fear as rebellion, an act of disrespect. His solution: surveillance. He began having her rooms searched daily, her letters intercepted. He had mirrors placed to spy on her movements and servants assigned to watch her facial expressions. He accused her of plotting with foreign courts to humiliate him to spread rumors about his condition. The bed, once a torture chamber, became a throne of control. The queen endured further sessions, each orchestrated like a scientific experiment. She was drugged, restrained, and forced into rituals that were more mechanical than marital. Her body was studied, her reactions monitored, and every failure blamed on her. When she developed phantom pregnancies, false signs of conception caused by stress and psychological breakdown, Ferdinand briefly rejoiced, only to spiral into fury when they proved false. His paranoia deepened. Her despair grew. In 1818, after 2 years of psychological erosion and physical agony, Isabella finally escaped the only way women like her could. She died. The official cause was nervous exhaustion, but those close to her knew the signs: self-starvation, laudanum dependency, silent prayers that asked for release, not recovery. Her final words spoken to her confessor were allegedly, "Thank God it's over." Ferdinand did not mourn. He interrogated her staff, accused her ladies-in-waiting of poisoning her, ordered multiple autopsies looking for signs of betrayal, and once again within weeks began the search for a new wife. Because for Ferdinand, the problem was never him. It was always them. And if one queen died, there would always be another. But behind the marble tomb and golden crown lay a deeper truth. Isabella's nightmare wasn't a personal failure. It was the consequence of placing unchecked power in the hands of a man whose body and soul had both turned monstrous. By the time Ferdinand VII married his third wife, the Spanish court had stopped pretending this was about love. This was no longer a fairy tale. It was a medical trial, a dynastic experiment wrapped in silk and shadow. And Maria Josepha of Saxony, the unfortunate woman chosen for this experiment, was not a bride. She was a subject. She arrived in Madrid in 1819, 24 years old, far older than the teenage princesses who had preceded her. But that wasn't by accident. Ferdinand's advisors were no longer searching for beauty or charm. They needed a woman with resilience, obedience, and a strong reproductive history. Maria Josepha checked every box. She was a devout Catholic, came from a minor but desperate royal house, and most importantly, had no known physical or psychological delicacies. To Ferdinand, she wasn't a person. She was the next attempt. But unlike Isabella or Maria Antonia, Maria Josepha came with instructions of her own. Before accepting the match, her family had conducted private consultations with court physicians and extracted a disturbing level of detail about Ferdinand's condition. She knew about the deformity. She had heard of the failed pregnancies, the trauma, the restraints. And yet her family, plagued by debts and political irrelevance, agreed to the match. Perhaps they believed she could endure it. Perhaps they simply sold her to a kingdom on the edge of collapse. Her approach to the marriage was clinical. There were no dreams of romance, no illusions about intimacy. She traveled to Madrid with her own team of physicians, a chest of custom medical tools, and a personal journal in which she would document day by day the tragic absurdity of her union. The wedding was scaled down. No extravagant parades, no overflowing fountains or fireworks. Just a quiet ceremony followed by an anxious silence. The first night followed a schedule. Her doctors administered sedatives. The bedchamber had been remodeled, reinforced frame, new cushion designs, medically approved oils and lighting set at an exact dimness to avoid psychological distress. Ferdinand, for his part, had grown even more twisted. His deformity had worsened over time, now requiring greater support just to avoid injury to himself. But what had truly changed was his psychology. He no longer hoped for passion or even reproduction. He wanted controlled documentation evidence. He wanted the process of sex to be measured, recorded, and confirmed like an autopsy with live subjects. Maria Josepha did not scream. She did not flinch. She followed instructions. She wrote down timings, positions, reactions. She noted swelling, bleeding, discomfort terms more at home in a surgical manual than a diary of marital life. Her detachment became her defense, and in a cruel twist it enraged Ferdinand even more than his previous wife's terror had. Because she didn't fear him. She studied him. To a man consumed by shame, being analyzed felt worse than being screamed at. Ferdinand began suspecting that his new queen was a spy, that she was sending reports to Saxony about his humiliations, His paranoia metastasized. He ordered surveillance of her correspondence, interrogated her attendants, accused her of leaking information to foreign powers, of plotting to reveal the royal secret to Europe's mocking courts. In truth, her only crime was clarity. She saw him for what he was: not a king, but a broken man held together by title and delusion. Still they tried. For a decade, Maria Josepha participated in over 100 scheduled sessions. They followed lunar cycles, dietary adjustments, temperature controls, prayers, potions. At one point, Ferdinand commissioned a team of circus anatomists and French physiologists to observe the process. Yes, he turned their marriage bed into a theater of grotesque science. The queen endured it all with blank precision, and then miraculously she conceived. In 1829, after 10 years of brutal procedure and sterile hope, Maria Josepha became pregnant. The palace exploded with relief, but the child, a daughter, was born prematurely and died within hours. Maria Josepha herself followed 3 weeks later, succumbing to infection, despair, or both. Her body was buried, her journals sealed. Ferdinand never spoke her name again. But in the margins of those hidden notebooks, one sentence remained scribbled in the final days before her death: "I have fulfilled the experiment." But not the life. And that was the legacy of Ferdinand's third marriage: not love, not lineage, but a sterile monument to how power can turn intimacy into inquiry and a woman into nothing more than data. While Ferdinand VII was obsessing over bedchamber contraptions, Spain was dying. The empire that had once ruled continents was now crumbling at its foundations, its colonies revolting, its treasury bleeding, and its people starving. But the king didn't notice, or rather he didn't care. Because while generals begged for reinforcements and ministers scrambled to stop economic collapse, Ferdinand was locked away in his palace, surrounded by vials of potions, drawings of his own anatomy, and a rotating cast of foreign doctors promising to solve the one problem that truly haunted him: the thing between his legs. This wasn't just royal distraction. It was personal pathology masquerading as leadership. Ferdinand's obsession with his deformity had metastasized, consuming not just his marriages but his entire reign. Every political decision was delayed by his medical episodes. Cabinet meetings were rescheduled to accommodate fertility sessions. Tax policies were signed in bed in between attempts at intimacy. Wars were ignored. Famines went unaided. Because a king with a broken body had become a king with a broken mind. At the very heart of his madness was the belief that everything revolved around his ability or inability to father a child. His masculinity wasn't a private concern. It was a national crisis. And so the bedroom became a theater of imperial policy. The failure to produce an heir wasn't just personal humiliation. It was treated as divine punishment, political sabotage, and proof of betrayal. While Latin America erupted in revolution, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, all declaring independence, Ferdinand responded not with reforms or diplomacy, but with surveillance, witch hunts, and bedroom inspections. He believed his enemies were poisoning him through contact with his wives, that liberal conspirators were hiding in mirrors, that God himself was testing his virility. To defend against this imagined war, he created a palace state of paranoia. Food tasters were rotated hourly. Walls were drilled with peepholes so he could spy on Queen Maria Christina's every move. Chambermaids were interrogated for facial expressions, and every shadow became a suspect. The king's spiral wasn't silent. It bled into every corner of the monarchy. Guards disappeared for saying the wrong thing. Ministers were dismissed for raising their eyebrows. Even children in the palace were taught not to laugh too loudly, in case their joy was mistaken for mockery. Because Ferdinand, by this point, saw mockery everywhere. In the way people bowed, in the way they spoke his name, in the way they looked away too quickly or not quickly enough, and the cost of this delusion was catastrophic. Spain lost its colonies, its economy collapsed, its people revolted. While other European nations embraced reform, Spain, drowned in regression, dragged backward by a king whose rule was dictated not by law or reason, but by fear, dysfunction, and unhealed trauma. Ferdinand restored the Inquisition. He banned newspapers. He reversed constitutional reforms. all to silence the growing realization that their king was not just unfit, but unwell. His public image became a joke across Europe. Foreign ambassadors sent coded letters describing the biological burden of the Spanish court. In secret correspondence, Ferdinand was referred to as El Obsesionado, the obsessed, not with power, not with God, but with himself, with a single body part that had come to define not just his manhood but the entire fate of his kingdom. By the late 1820s, the court was no longer a court, it was a hospice for a man unraveling. His face grew sunken, his hands trembled. He stopped trusting even his closest allies. He would sit for hours staring at portraits of his dead wives, speaking to them in hushed tones, asking why they had failed him. He no longer asked for advice, only for loyalty, blind, terrified loyalty. And so, Spain bled. While Ferdinand clutched at his delusions, the nation fractured. The empire shrank to a shadow of itself, and the people who once worshipped their king came to see him as what he truly was: not a ruler, not a father, not even a man, but a symptom of a disease that had infected the monarchy for centuries. Unchecked power in the hands of a man too broken to hold it. Ferdinand wasn't just mad, he was contagious, and the country he touched would take generations to recover. By 1829, Ferdinand VII was a ghost in royal robes, a man whose body had betrayed him, whose mind had unraveled, and whose kingdom lay in tatters. 3 wives had died under his reign, each more broken than the last. His people whispered behind closed doors. Europe laughed behind folded letters. And yet, despite all logic, despite all medical certainty, despite the absolute failure of everything that had come before, Spain still needed an heir. The monarchy demanded it. The church prayed for it. And Ferdinand, he demanded one final chance. Enter Maria Cristina of Naples. Young, elegant, and most crucially fertile. But there was one complication: she was already pregnant when she arrived in Madrid. Everyone at court saw the obvious. Her stomach was beginning to swell before the ink on the marriage contract was dry. But Ferdinand, in an act of breathtaking denial, or perhaps calculated desperation, chose to believe what he needed to: that this child somehow was his. The wedding was a quiet affair, more transaction than celebration. No crowds lined the streets, no ballads were sung. Just weary nobles, exhausted ministers, and a king gripping onto the illusion that God had finally answered his prayers by unconventional means. When Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, in 1830, it was declared a miracle. Bells rang across Spain. The throne had an heir. The monarchy had hope. Ferdinand had a child to justify the years of agony, blood, and humiliation. But behind the joy, the lie festered. Ferdinand knew the truth, or at least he feared it. The girl was healthy, beautiful, and bore no sign of the twisted bloodline he had spent his life trying to extend. There were no genetic markers of deformity, no inherited signs of royal decay, and that paradoxically made her suspect. Because if the child was too perfect, was she even his? The very miracle he celebrated by day became a source of torment by night. He began obsessing over her features, ordering portraits to be painted of both himself and the baby at every stage of her growth. He would compare them side by side, looking for resemblances no one else could see. Were her eyes too wide? Was her jaw too delicate? Did she favor Maria Cristina's old music tutor, or the young Italian courier who had once traveled with her household? Every smile the child gave became a question, every coo a potential betrayal. Ferdinand's surveillance didn't stop with paintings. He had genealogists study facial structures. He consulted physicians on hereditary traits. He even tasked palace guards with monitoring Maria Cristina's behavior, what she read, who she spoke to, what time she went to chapel. Private letters were intercepted, conversations analyzed, meals tested, not for poison but for signs of conspiracy. Because in his mind, the ultimate act of treason wasn't rebellion, it was paternity fraud. Maria Cristina, for her part, learned to live inside this suffocating fishbowl. She moved through her chambers like an actress, controlling every gesture, every smile, every glance. She never showed fear, only devotion. She called Ferdinand "mi re" in public and submitted quietly in private. But her personal letters, discovered generations later hidden behind the paneling of her dressing room, tell a different story. She described feeling like a specimen in a jar, watched day and night, terrified that even a sneeze could trigger a new investigation. And still, Ferdinand hoped. Despite the paranoia, despite the sleepless nights and the constant dread, he convinced himself that if he could just once conceive a child that bore his blood, all would be redeemed. So he tried. Again and again, even in his late 40s, with a failing body, trembling hands, and a mind unraveling. He subjected Maria Cristina to the same rituals he had imposed on his previous wives: bedroom inspections, medical consultations, intercourse, scheduled like military campaigns, all in the hope of producing an heir that would erase his shame. But none came. Isabella remained his only child, a child he both cherished and resented. She was a symbol of hope, yes, but also the final bitter proof of his failure. Because what kind of king leaves behind a legacy that may not even share his blood? And so, Ferdinand spent his final years in a palace filled with mirrors and shadows, speaking to portraits, watching his queen from behind peepholes, and clinging to a daughter who may or may not have been his, while the nation outside his gates continued to fall apart. The empire was dying, but in his mind, the only thing that mattered was whether that little girl smiling in her royal crib was truly his redemption, or the final lie. There's something uniquely terrifying about a king who no longer trusts his own shadow. In his final years, Ferdinand VII wasn't ruling Spain, he was haunting it. A hollowed-out monarch trapped in a decaying palace, his mind riddled with suspicion, his body failing his court reduced to a theater of whispers and lies. He had already buried 3 wives, watched his empire collapse, and crowned a daughter he wasn't sure he had fathered. But instead of seeking peace, he waged war on his servants, his queen, his sanity. And by the end, there was no distinction left between ruler and prisoner, between king and madman. Only Ferdinand, alone, obsessed and slowly unraveling. The deeper his paranoia sank, the more elaborate his surveillance became. Ferdinand had secret peepholes drilled into the walls of his wife's chambers so he could watch her in silence. He spent hours pressing his eye against the cold marble, studying Maria Cristina as she read, prayed, or simply breathed, looking for signs of betrayal in the movement of her hands or the curl of her lips. He assigned spies to monitor her private letters, demanded transcripts of her conversations, and interrogated maids about how long she lingered at the window or which priest heard her confession. Nothing was too small to be suspect. When she redecorated a room, he assumed she was building hiding places for weapons. When she wore new perfume, he accused her of trying to mask the scent of poison. Even religious devotion, long his moral anchor, turned into a threat. If Maria Cristina prayed too often, he wondered which god she was speaking to and what secrets she was confessing. His obsession with control extended beyond his marriage. Ministers were subjected to loyalty tests so absurd they bordered on parody. He would intentionally contradict himself in private meetings to see if they would correct him, then punish them if they did. Guards were rotated daily to prevent corruption. Food was tasted, then left to sit for half an hour before being served in case the poison needed time to take effect. Several tasters collapsed under the stress of constant suspicion, only reinforcing his belief that conspiracies were everywhere. The palace, once a place of pageantry and power, had become a prison of mirrors. Courtiers learned to speak in code. They avoided eye contact. Entire conversations were carried out in nods, gestures, and silences carefully crafted to avoid provoking the king. Children were told not to laugh in the halls. Flowers were arranged with obsessive symmetry. Even birthday gifts were inspected for hidden messages. No one was safe. Everyone was watched. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's health began to fail. His hands shook. He slept poorly. He grew bloated, constipated, erratic. He mumbled to himself in the corridors and often mistook his reflection for intruders. His physicians described a nervous trembling that would not subside, paired with delusional thinking and violent emotional outbursts. In today's terms, we might diagnose him with severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or even paranoid schizophrenia. But in 1833, there was no treatment, only isolation and fear. Even his daughter Isabella, the supposed miracle child, became a source of anxiety. Ferdinand both adored and resented her. He commissioned paintings of her every 6 months, scrutinizing them for signs of genetic resemblance. Sometimes he would call her to his chamber and stare at her in silence as if willing the truth into her face. Other times, he would rant that she was a fraud planted by foreign powers. She was the symbol of everything he both needed and feared: legacy betrayal, and the one secret he could never confirm. When death finally came, it wasn't a grand spectacle. It was a quiet unraveling. Ferdinand drifted in and out of delirium, calling out to his dead wives, issuing orders to invisible enemies, and clutching letters that no longer made sense. His final breath came not with dignity, but with dread. The official cause was gout, but the truth was more damning. He died of exhaustion, of shame, of madness grown so thick it choked out everything human left in him. And when his body was laid out, the royal physicians, those same men who had spent decades trying to correct his curse, performed one last autopsy. They found exactly what they feared: a grotesquely enlarged, misshapen sexual organ, twisted and scarred from decades of failed treatments and secret attempts at self-surgery. It wasn't just a body part. It was a symbol of power abused, of pain denied, of a man broken from the inside out. Spain buried its king, but it would spend generations recovering from the disease he became. In death, most kings are remembered for their crowns. Ferdinand VII was remembered for something far more grotesque. When the royal physicians began the final autopsy in the hidden chambers of the Palacio Real, they weren't just examining a corpse, they were unlocking the final unspeakable chapter of a reign defined by dysfunction. The truth they uncovered was not simply medical, it was symbolic. Because what lay beneath Ferdinand's silk burial robes wasn't just a deformed body part, it was the embodiment of an empire's decay, a nation's shame, and a monarchy twisted beyond recognition by centuries of arrogance, incest, and silence. The records, sealed and smuggled into the Vatican archives under strict orders, described it in almost clinical horror: an organ over 14 inches in length with unnatural girth fluctuations, extensive scarring, and signs of multiple failed attempts at self-modification. Yes, Ferdinand had tried to fix it himself. Over the course of decades, he had secretly performed amateur surgeries on his own genitals, using rudimentary instruments, hoping to reshape what nature and history had cursed him with. Instead, he had only mutilated himself further. The tissue was riddled with scar lines, irregular growths, and nerve damage so extensive that normal function would have been virtually impossible. But this wasn't just a medical discovery, it was the physical proof of everything his reign represented: pain, denial, obsession, and the futile desire to control what cannot be controlled. The physicians didn't just preserve his body, they preserved a monument to the collapse of royal reason. And they knew it. That's why the organ, the drawings, and the accompanying notes were hidden from public view, locked away, labeled top secret. Not because they were obscene, but because they were too true. Because what Ferdinand carried between his legs was more than a deformity. It was the wound Spain never stopped bleeding from. A reminder of how the most private human shame, when tied to absolute power, can rot not just a man but a country. Historians still debate how many of Ferdinand's actions were political and how many were pathological. But the autopsy drew no distinction. His body told the real story, a body that had consumed 3 wives. That had driven policy through the lens of paranoia. That had turned sex into strategy, reproduction into national crisis, and personal failure into public catastrophe. And what was left behind: a daughter, Isabelle II, whose paternity was questioned even as she was crowned. A country stripped of its overseas colonies. A royal legacy mocked in foreign courts. And a broken monarchy limping into the modern age with no answers, no credibility, and no heirs untainted by the shadow of his reign. Ferdinand's legacy was not measured in laws passed or wars won. It was measured in trauma, in whispered rumors, in shattered marriages, in the dead eyes of queens who had no voice, in the stammering bureaucrats forced to tiptoe around his delusions, in the ink-stained letters from diplomats who could only describe him in euphemism: unstable, obsessed, unfit. His reign proved a brutal truth, that a kingdom led by a man who cannot govern himself will inevitably fall into chaos. that an empire ruled by a tortured body becomes a tortured nation, and that when shame becomes law, pain becomes policy. Even today, few Spanish textbooks speak of Ferdinand's condition. Official biographies still dance around the word deformity. But in the silence, the truth grows louder, because behind every collapsed dynasty is a secret that everyone knew, but no one dared to name. Ferdinand VII didn't just die in 1833. He became a warning. His body preserved and hidden is a time capsule of unchecked privilege, of what happens when a man's private madness is given a throne. His oversized legacy was not cast in marble or sung in poems, but sealed in Vatican vaults where it waits in darkness, like the echo of a scream Spain still hasn't stopped hearing. What if the downfall of a kingdom didn't come from war, rebellion, or foreign invasion, but from a single man's anatomy? Ferdinand VII's reign forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that absolute power, when placed in the hands of someone consumed by shame, paranoia, and private dysfunction, becomes a national tragedy. His deformed body wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was the physical manifestation of centuries of dynastic arrogance, of incest disguised as tradition of silence, mistaken for stability. Spain didn't fall because of enemies at the gates, it fell because of rot at the center. His 3 dead wives, his ghost-like daughter, his shattered court, these weren't footnotes. They were casualties of a system that protected power while ignoring pain. In the end, Ferdinand was not just a monster nor merely a victim. He was a mirror, a dark reflection of what happens when ego overrides empathy and when a nation mistakes bloodline for legitimacy. His story is a warning that beneath the silk and scepter, even kings bleed. And when that wound is left to fester, it doesn't just destroy the man, it poisons everything he was meant to protect. The story of Ferdinand VII is more than a disturbing chapter in royal history. It's a powerful reminder of how unresolved personal pain, when left unchecked, can ripple outward and destroy everything around us. Ferdinand wasn't just a king with a rare medical condition. He was a man consumed by shame obsession and the need to control what he couldn't accept about himself. And because he had absolute power, that pain became policy. His paranoia became national doctrine. His trauma shaped the destiny of millions. This isn't just history, it's a reflection of a timeless human truth. When we ignore our inner wounds, they don't disappear. They metastasize. In families, in relationships, in leadership. A person in denial about their insecurities can become controlling. A parent unable to face their fears can pass that fear to their children. A leader ruled by ego can bring down entire institutions. The lesson: heal yourself before you harm others. Whether you're leading a household, a company, or a country, your unspoken pain has power. It can drive cruelty, sabotage, intimacy, and distort reality. But when acknowledged, processed, and faced with courage, it can also lead to wisdom, to empathy, to change. Because history doesn't just repeat itself, it warns us, if we're willing to listen. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even shudder, don't let it end here. Drop a comment and tell us what shocked you most about Ferdinand's legacy. Save this video to revisit the lessons hidden in history's darkest corners, and if you want more stories that challenge what you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into the past to understand the present, and trust me, there's so much more to uncover. Your engagement keeps this channel alive, and your voice helps history speak louder. Let's question, learn, and grow together.